In the early 1940s, when I was just a young girl, World War II had engulfed Europe, and Adolf Hitler planned to control all of it. At first, the U.S. was neutral, but when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the U.S. officially joined the war. A year and a half later, Aberdeen opened what would later be known as the Pheasant Canteen.
To understand the work and the importance of this canteen, you really need to take a look at and understand the importance of World War II.
For some reason, I remember December 7th, 1941, like it was yesterday.
I can tell you exactly what I was doing.
I had been working in Mankato and I came home.
I was standing on the porch and my husband was washing his car.
My fiance was over at our house on Sunday afternoon. We were listening to radio.
And I was laying on the floor listening to either Inner Sanctum or the Shadow Knows or something like that when they butted in with Pearl Harbor.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin.
Pretty soon he yelled, "Pearl Harbor was bombed."
We heard the president speak.
A date which will live in infamy.
I remember seeing the pictures at the theater of the devastation.
And I said to my dad, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Probably war."
Many of the guys felt angry and they went and enlisted.
I was only out of high school about a year. That's when I enlisted. I was still 19 years old when I was assigned officer in charge to the landing craft tank 354.
At the beginning, no women were allowed in any of the services. And then they opened up the waves. Women accepted for voluntary emergency service. I applied and was accepted into the Navy.
And then I joined the Army, where I was a medic, and I worked in Army hospitals.
I had a brother in the Marines, brother in the Army, brother in the Air Force, and I was in the Navy all at the same time.
Women were involved doing the work of the men who were displaced out of the factories to make the war things that they needed.
So we searched the papers and thought, oh, North American, they're looking for workers. So we went there, and of course, you're Rosie the Riveter from the very beginning there, and they try to figure out your capabilities. Well, Rosie the Riveter was a name that we all had when we came to North American, because they did so much riveting on the plane. We were very particular about our work because the boys were going to use those planes and we didn't want anything to happen to them.
Since there were conflicts in both Europe and the South Pacific, the U.S. military had to move troops. At that time, the most efficient mode of travel was by train. We didn't have commercial air travel yet, and cars weren't designed for long distances. So the military used special troop trains on existing rail lines. Aberdeen, South Dakota was a natural stop for troop trains running from Chicago to Seattle and back. After all, we were the hub city of the Dakotas.
It may be a little hard to imagine in today's world that Aberdeen was a vibrant railroad city. Many, many passenger trains every day taking travelers to both coasts.
We had 4 railroads here. That's why it was called Hub City.
The thing that was amazing was, it was all coal steam engines.
The bigger the load they had on that train, the louder the steam engine was.
This town was built on railroading.
And of course, with these troops going through, they were either going east or west. There wasn't much reason to be going north or south.
And Aberdeen was about the halfway stopping point.
That's when they refueled and they took in water.
And at one time, there were 4 or 5 trains a day that came through Aberdeen. And if you can imagine, when they were still doing that along with these troop trains, there wasn't a lot of room on those tracks.
And boy, did we have troop trains coming through here.
Well, a trooper is an individual who was part of the troops. The troops were the terms we used to describe the service people.
When I left here by train, I think it took 5 days on a troop train to get to San Francisco. It wasn't the best of conditions either.
We stopped at depots along the way, and there was no food served on the train, as I recall.
Trains are very, very crowded, and the troops are going from East Coast to West Coast.
You spent a lot of time just sleeping and stuff if you could. Kind of wanted to save up some of that rest.
In the context of this nationwide effort, People were desperate for some way they could help.
When those troops came in, there was no place where they could go to a vending machine or a counter. And for another thing, time-wise, when those trains came, these young men and women that were on the train didn't have time to walk down the street and find a place to eat because they didn't know when the train was going to go again. And that was one of the reasons that the people in the community became involved.
A lot of folks in town wanted to do something special for the servicemen and women, so Mayor Tiffany called a meeting and someone suggested a canteen. It was August 19th of 1943 when Aberdeen opened what would eventually be known as the Pheasant Canteen. The Red Cross and USO provided medical assistance and free lunches to hundreds of troops traveling through Aberdeen every day. It was one thing we could do to help the war effort.
At that point in time, food was prepared at home. They did their own baking and made pies and a lot of other good things. So as the community people got together, it was relatively simple to gather food from people who were very good cooks, very generous.
They could show they were supporting the war effort by helping out in this manner.
And they could relate to these young men and women who were displaced from their family and their mothers and their home life. It was a happy moment for them to be able to say a personal thank you through a sandwich and a glass of milk or a cup of coffee.
The canteen was supported by all sorts of organizations, but it was the Red Cross and the USO that donated $1,000 apiece to get the canteen into operation. $2,000 in 1943 translates to roughly $26,000 today. 15 supervisors were trained in nutrition and managed as many as 15 volunteers apiece.
Well, I became involved in the canteen because of my mother. She was one of the original women who went down and began the canteen. And so I remember very, very vividly the trains coming in and hundreds of people were just flying in there, and they literally ran towards the depot.
Imagine yourself standing here surrounded by people, bumping into you. They have only minutes to get on and off the train. Just imagine the hustle and bustle, the day in and day out, trains coming, trains going, people standing, people bumping into you.
It felt like it was just filled completely.
You couldn't move unless everybody moved together. It was just packed like sardines.
It was noisy, you know, probably 200 or 300 men and women.
Navy guys would yell at the Army guys, and the Army guys would yell at the Marine guys, and they'd all pick it on the other side. You know, you guys aren't any good, you don't fight anybody, you know, all that. You got to understand that these guys probably weren't sure if they were going to live. They knew they were going somewhere where they probably could get shot at. There was a lot of tension probably, and this is how they broke the tension.
The room was small, 4 feet by 30 along the north wall of the lobby. I look at that space now and wonder how 15 people could crowd in there and work. But we were young and slender back then, so we managed. On the second floor, there were large rooms used by the Milwaukee Women's Club. We had long tables and a kitchen with a sink and refrigerator. That's where we prepared all the food. Looking back, it's amazing what went on here on a daily basis for 2.5 years straight.
The troop trains were large, so there was a big supply of people who came in all at once. And you were very, very busy. With coffee, and we had milk, water, and the pheasant sandwiches, and then always birthday cake. There was always somebody's birthday someplace, and there was always a decorated birthday cake.
A lot of pies. I know my mother used to make some pies and carry them down there.
It took a lot of organizing, being ready for them.
When a train was coming in, they'd give them about an hour notification, and everyone run down there and start making things.
Sometimes they wouldn't know, maybe even for a matter of 10, 15 minutes, there was a train coming in. There could have been 4 or 6, or they might come any time during the day or night.
You didn't know when some of those trains were coming in, so you had to be ready to go at the jump of a whistle, and I think every single person who worked there did.
There wasn't any doubt that those people were totally committed to what they were doing.
My team worked the last Sunday of every month. We arrived at 8 a.m., but the supervisor was already there with the inventory sheet and a chart that listed all the jobs and who was responsible. Food preparation was different in those days. We didn't have modern food processors. Our vegetables and meat had to be ground with a small hand-turned food chopper. Nothing came pre-packaged. We cleaned our vegetables, boiled our eggs, baked cookies and cakes, and cleaned the pheasants.
We'd come early in the morning, whatever's assigned to us, and we prepared our sandwiches.
All of the sandwiches were made in another part of the building.
So it was a little bit more footwork, but it seemed like every single person knew what they were to do. You do this, you lay the bread down, you put the butter on, you spread the butter, you put the sandwich spread on, you spread the sandwich bread, you put that top on. Now you cut it and fold it and put it in the basket, and it goes zip, 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 zip. Everybody that worked there had a purpose, and that made it exciting.
A lot of the young girls from high school came down there and cooked the eggs and chopped them, and at that time I was too young to do any of that stuff. We were the runners.
My best friend and I, we were both young girls, we would go and tell the people that were preparing food, they need more cookies, they need more sandwiches, whatever.
I would go down when they were short of help. My mother would say, "You're going down." It was really something seeing all these soldiers.
Many of the trains, the troops were not allowed to leave. And we Boy Scouts then, our responsibility at that time was then to take the food to them, just hand it basically through the windows. Why they weren't able to leave, we never were sure, but we wondered a lot. One of these guys leaning out the window handed me a $100 bill and asked me to go buy him a quart of whiskey. And I looked at him and I said, "Sir, I'm 12 years old and I'm probably 5 foot tall. Do you think anybody's going to sell me a quart of whiskey?" I said, "I doubt it seriously." And to the best of my recollection, I gave him back his $100 bill.
And of course, you know, young fellows away from home, they like to see pretty girls, and sometimes there were some very energetic and enthusiastic young women that would go out and go on the train and grab a couple soldiers and say, "Come on in and get something to eat," and then of course the rest all followed. Over the course of time, Aberdeen became known for this canteen, so that if they knew they were coming here, they were ready to get off that train and get into the depot.
Well, you had about 15 minutes to get off the train.
Run into the depot, use the bathroom, get something to eat, and they had to get back out on the train.
We didn't have styrofoam cups then, so we had to run, drink coffee real fast and run back on with a handful of sandwiches. There's always a worry the train's going to leave without you, but they never did.
The boys had only 12 to 15 minutes, so they ate and talked fast. They couldn't understand how we could give away all that food for no payment in return. Evidently, most of them came from areas where people were less generous. We told them it was the South Dakota home folks trying to do their part. After the last train left the station, we cleaned the canteen, put all the washed milk bottles into their containers, washed the coffee urns, and carried everything back up the stairs to the club rooms. The supervisor would inventory while the rest of us scrubbed the floors. The latest I ever worked was 2 a.m., but I'm sure there were others who worked much later.
It didn't start out as a pheasant sandwich.
They started out with a menu that consisted of ham sandwiches, cookies, fruits, milk, and the like. And then in the fall, some of the farmers began to bring pheasants to the people at the canteen. And they developed a pheasant sandwich using pheasant with some eggs and some other ingredients.
Well, it made such a hit. They became so accepted right away, and they continued to bring pheasants in.
The pheasant hunts came about because of the quantity they needed for the troop trains coming through Aberdeen. Hunts were organized by the churches in the area.
And there were a lot of guys that volunteered to go out and shoot the pheasants.
There wasn't such a thing as a limit. If there was, no one paid a bit of attention to it. You had an old pickup, you just kept throwing birds in it. Didn't make much difference whether it was a hen or a cock that got up in front of you. When you're trying to feed all these soldiers, you have to have pheasants.
Typical day, we would shoot anywhere from 700 to 800 pheasants. The game wardens knew what we were doing or what the pheasant hunts were for, and they would kind of look the other direction.
The supply was there, and that was one source they had that they knew they could access. They used to bring them in by the truckload, and they got cleaned and then became part of our famous Pheasant Canteen.
It was unique because no one else was doing that, and of course when the fellows came in, they were delighted.
And especially after they'd heard about the pheasant sandwiches, that seemed to travel all over the country. And they would come in and they would say, "Where's the pheasant sandwich? Where do we get a pheasant sandwich?" And of course we had them because we'd made them fresh that morning right there at the depot. It was an exciting time.
And to our knowledge, this is the only place that served pheasant sandwiches.
The pheasant sandwiches became the trademark of the Aberdeen Canteen. It soon became nationally famous from reports from the troops. Cash donations and letters of appreciation came from mothers and the troops themselves, from all parts of the world, praising the hospitality of the workers and the mouth-watering goodness of the pheasant sandwiches. But it wasn't just the sandwiches that made the Aberdeen Pheasant Canteen so famous. It was the hospitality and community-wide effort. It was a different time with a different attitude. We didn't have all the digital distractions we do today. Our TV was the radio, and our social media was the community.
In the 1940s, you did not have the media, you didn't have TV. Most people had a telephone, and most homes had a radio.
I can remember my own family sitting around listening to these radio programs at night after supper. The Lone Ranger, Batman, and all of those that were on the radio. That was our entertainment, other than a movie. And the movies were, for the most part, black and white.
I remember one day my dad took us to school in the car. That was quite an event.
We didn't have much. We didn't have all these toys.
There was no such thing as a computer or an iPhone.
My husband was out in the Pacific and sometimes wouldn't hear from him for 5 weeks, and we just had to trust the Lord that he was taking care of him.
But today, if anything happens, even throughout the world before the day is over, you know about it.
It wasn't something you lived through CNN and Fox TV. You lived it right here.
Children didn't begin to have the activities that we have today. Most of the time they were with their parents, and one of the reasons that I was at the canteen was because my mother was down there working.
Those women really worked hard. Well, there were men involved too, but I mean, they didn't have the modern conveniences that we have now.
So they had to do it all by hand.
We had waxed paper, which wasn't the easiest thing to fold. It didn't hold, you know. Well, today you'd take your clingy wrapped paper and it would bing bing and you'd be done with it. Wax paper doesn't go bing bing.
They saved everything. I watched the video and they're folding bread sacks, and nowadays people would just throw that stuff away.
World War II, we'd not seen anything like this in the country, and it affected everybody.
Most people did not have a lot of money.
The economy was not very good.
And living out in the farm in Brown County, you didn't have much to eat.
We survived by not eating butter.
We're only allowed so much sugar, so much coffee.
Groceries were rationed, fuel was rationed.
Pretty much everything was rationed.
A war ration means just that. You can't access all you'd like.
They gave us ration books, and you could tear out a piece of paper, which ticket was for coffee and which was sugar.
Products that were going to feed all the troops all over left the civilians short-handed at that time.
It was a rather simple kind of life.
I even remember rationing for shoes. My mother used to get so mad at me because I jumped rope all the time and wore out my shoes.
Whether it was through buying war bonds or giving up rationed butter and other goods to help the canteen continue to function, everybody shared in the sacrifice of war, and the generosity was unbelievable. Most of the canteen's goods were donated, and various groups organized dances and raffles to support the canteen.
This Pheasant Canteen story is one of the biggest stories that came out of Aberdeen during World War II and really in recent history, simply for the fact of the extent of the volunteer effort.
They wanted everybody to know that people in South Dakota were doing everything they could to help support the war effort.
We had kids collecting cans. Gene Eisenbrace sold one of his prize goats and gave the proceeds to the Pheasant Canteen.
Donated the pig, auctioned it off, donated it back, auctioned it off, donated it back. I guess this same pig got auctioned off like 9 times that day before somebody finally took it home.
In my case, I come from a strong Irish mother who didn't give me a choice about volunteering. She just said, you'll be there, and I was there, my uniform on.
Everybody was contributing in some way.
We got pheasants from people all over. They just were so kind.
The locker plant cleaned them, Milwaukee Cafe cooked them, and the women chopped them up and made pheasant sandwiches.
First it was in the Aberdeen community, and then it began to spread to surrounding communities, and eventually it was organized to the point that different home extension clubs, church groups, and the like would take a day and they would serve at the canteen. They'd come in and work and bring their food. Organized groups came from as far away as Redfield, Britain, over by Webster,
Roscoe, Warner, Groton, the towns around Ipswich.
There were canteen workers in almost every community. The train or the rail line was really cooperative. If the people, for instance, in the community of Redfield wanted to send something in for the canteen, they would take their goods down to the train and the train would bring it in. There was no cost.
Everything was donated. They didn't charge to clean the birds. They didn't charge to cook birds. Time was donated. Nobody got paid for it.
They had to buy certain things, like they had to buy buns, but I think the bakeries sold their goods for next to nothing.
When they were a little short on food, maybe they'd had 2 or more trains than they averaged, the radio station was very helpful, and if the canteen was running short of food, they would send out a message, the ladies at the canteen need some help, they need some more food. One day in particular, the fellow at the radio station had sent out a message, the ladies at the canteen need some pie. And pretty soon the people at the railroad began to call the women from the canteen and say, we need some help because we have pie all over. Everyone's bringing us pie. So the response was terrific. It was a way for the people in this community could do their part of saying thank you to those that were gone.
And they weren't there because they wanted their name in the paper. They were there because they felt a need to help.
Some of the women were Gold Star mothers, and this is one way they wanted to do is volunteer.
They used to have what they called Gold Star mothers, and it was a little piece of cloth with a gold star in the middle. And if you saw one hanging in a home, you knew they lost a child. There was a blue star that symbolized somebody, you had somebody in the military, but the gold one was that they no longer were alive.
The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, but the war continued on in the South Pacific. On August 6, 1945, a nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, a more powerful bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, destroying the community. It was a good day, but also a sad day. These bombs had convinced the Japanese to surrender, but they also destroyed many lives. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese agreed to surrender, and the war ended. 68,000 South Dakotan soldiers left for war, and 1,426 never made it home. As the rest returned to civilian life, the Pheasant Canteen stayed open until the last troops made their way home.
I specifically remember the end of the war when they had the street celebration. Everyone was so excited, they rejoiced.
The next day we took a train and going north up into the mountains. All of a sudden it stopped and they said the war is over. They let all of us out on the ground. Instead of yelling and whooping and hollering, they went out there and they stood there so still. Some of them I think were praying, and it was so quiet. I'll never forget it.
You know, when the war ended, there's really no celebration for us other than the fact that we knew eventually we'd probably come home.
Besides my husband, I had 2 brothers and 3 brother-in-laws, and they all came home unscratched.
My relatives all came back safe.
Came home on leave, and I had a brother killed in Italy.
My brother had been reported missing in action on Okinawa in end of April of 1945. I lost one brother in the Battle of the Bulge later on. So the war was very, very close to my family.
The canteen stayed open for 2.5 years until March of 1946, when the last troops returning home were served. During those months, more than 586,000 troops were served by the canteen. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower made his way through Aberdeen, and apparently we made an impact on him. By the end of the operation, we used 60 quarts of milk, 3 quarts of cream, 50 loaves of bread, 5 pounds of butter, 15 dozen hard-boiled eggs, 8 pounds of coffee, loads of vegetables, wax paper, and a gallon of salad dressing each day. It was the only Red Cross USO canteen in South Dakota, and the only one like it in the United States. You won't find that in your history books.
I think Aberdeen should be extremely proud to have been the place that had a canteen.
It was a viable, valuable asset to the country. Nobody came through on those trains that expected to get off for nothing and get fed food like that, and warmth and concern and attention that they got.
There were people who probably never came through South Dakota before and maybe haven't since then, but it made a lot of difference when they came.
I think it made a lasting impression on them. I think it was a wonderful thing.
It was something I think that Aberdeen should always be proud of having done, a part of our history.
The canteen was a great morale boost for the troops who came through, because they knew people cared and showed their concern. It was also a morale boost for the home folks, because we were doing what we could for the war effort. After 12 to 15 hours of work at the canteen, we were exhausted, but it was a good tired, because we were doing something worthwhile. After all, our civilization was at stake.
When this group decided that they were interested in saving this story, they came to us for advice, mostly on how to build an exhibit, what kind of research would they need to do.
There's a lot of history that's in Aberdeen that has gone unutilized. They're trying to preserve that history of not only the troops that came through town, the history that came through town, but the families that it affected just by this simple sandwich of pheasant sandwiches.
We have a display at the depot. We have several uniforms in there.
We've gathered memorabilia. People have given us things.
Insignias, there's some hats, there's some pins, there's things to see and do while you're there. They have flip charts of news articles and press releases and pictures and photos and plaques along the wall, their Hometown Hero Award. You could easily spend an hour just gazing at that stuff, and then we usually try to have people watch the video before they leave.
I would encourage everyone to take the time to go and walk through, look at the display that we have and what it means to you as an individual.
This gives you a chance to maybe step back in time to realize, hey, there were people that walked through this door to grab a train to fly over to overseas to fight during World War II. This gives kind of a lasting legacy of that tradition. In 2009, they were chosen as Aberdeen's Hometown Hero. But these gals, for their hard work and their patronage, dedication to not only the Pheasant Canteen, the pheasant sandwich, but basically as ambassadors, living tradition ambassadors for Aberdeen.
But we won that because of our involvement with the community and promoting what had happened at the canteen. And then a few months ago, we were recognized by the American Association of State and Local Histories. We won a very significant award from that organization.
The project won a certificate of merit, but they were one of 3 in the United States to get what they call the HIP, or History in Progress Award, which is over and above. It impressed the award committee so much they thought they needed a little extra recognition.
And it was because of the history that we've worked on and how we've preserved it.
We were glad to do what we have done, and we're not sorry we ever started it.
We really haven't looked for any recognition. We just want to get the point across that we need to be educated about it.
The canteen team's effort to save this story, the exhibit at the Milwaukee Depot, the research that went into this. This recognition that they got is based solely on today's work, on yesterday's project.
Thank you for seeing what we did. Thank you for thinking it was worthwhile. That was very nice.
We had the distinct honor of being present when the fellows left for the honor flight.
Honor flight was for any of the servicemen that wanted to fly to Washington, D.C. to see the memorial, you know, because that had just been built and a lot of people had never been there to see that. And
everyone that had served in World War II was eligible to take this trip.
It's wonderful going to Washington, D.C. The World War II monument was just made, and being it was my war, that's what I wanted to see.
Several people had been on it and said it was interesting, and I hadn't been there, so when I had a chance to go, I went.
It's very impressive.
It's spectacular. You know, all the states are represented, and both the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters.
They planned this for the soldiers, and it was such a wonderful thing. Everything was paid for these fellows.
Organizations from all over South Dakota raised money to get us to go.
The people actually donated these thousands and thousands of dollars.
Not only did we get to send them off Aberdeen-style welcome, but the ladies were there at 5 o'clock in the morning serving pheasant sandwiches.
The honor flight was leaving at 6:30.
They were there with pheasant sandwiches again, and that was wonderful.
It was an honor for us to serve them pheasant sandwiches when they left, and to see them get on that plane. You could just see it in their faces how proud they were to have served.
I mean, they do such a great job in what they do. We have them come out to the airport during our Rooster Rush promotion, South Dakota's version of homecoming, I guess, per se, the Rooster Rush. And we utilize the ladies out at the airport welcoming the hunters to town.
The men who came off of that were so, as if we were doing them such a wonderful favor. And all we were doing was giving them a pheasant sandwich and saying, "It's good to see you. Welcome to Aberdeen. Have a cup of coffee."
So we were promoting Aberdeen and the canteen and the pheasant.
Of course, the Chinese ringneck pheasant come over with the railroad. They released 6 birds in Redfield, South Dakota, 45 miles straight south of Aberdeen. And from there, they just blossomed and bloomed. I mean, the state harvests just under 2 million pheasants per year, all from those 6 birds that have started out. So you call them the grandparents, I guess you'd say. If they hadn't released those 6 birds in Redfield, there would be no pheasant crop harvest for the ladies with their pheasant sandwich, let alone we wouldn't be sitting here right now. So now, every fall, the ladies are there, ladies in waiting are there for their pheasant sandwiches to serve to the hunters as they flew in.
It's just a personal thing for most of us. We've done this because we want to preserve history.
You can read all the material you want about a man named Hitler or a man named Mussolini, but it hits home when you see local people involved in that scene and what they contributed and what they did and what they gave.
History is much more than a timeline of dates. And if we don't have something as a reference point to look at and model ourselves after, every generation then starts from ground zero.
If you don't take it down now, it's going to be gone forever. And it's one of those things that not only is it important to Aberdeen, it's important to a nation itself.
History is always something that needs to be preserved, and unfortunately, we forget so quickly. I doubt if there is, a couple hundred people remember there was a glider school in Aberdeen, South Dakota during the war. They would have planes pulling a glider, and inside the glider would be maybe 25, 30 troops. And then they'd go over the channel into France or wherever it was, and they'd cut the gliders loose, and all these gliders would land, and the troops would pop out, and here they've got a whole pile of troops there.
I just think that everybody should know what our soldiers went through.
It's just a time in history that changed our world.
And so our generation has to pass that history on to the next ones.
You can explore your own history. Talk to your grandparents. What are their stories? Who lived in your house before you did? What was your neighborhood like? You can be a detective and find out these stories. This example at the depot is a perfect place. You can look at the artifacts, you can watch the film. You can form your own opinion. History is not black and white. It's a little gray around the edges. Ride your bike up there. Take a look at it. Go inside. Imagine it full of young soldiers and women excited to serve them in however they can. Just let yourself stand in the center of that building and see what it says to you. And I think you might be surprised. You might see one of those soldiers walk through the door with a smile on his face and his hand out for a pheasant sandwich.
Well, I hope the exhibit keeps alive the idea that this is America, and to do everything we can to keep that dream alive and see that it is here for generations to come as it has been for yours and for mine.
Freedom is not free, and someone at some time has given their life or a part of their life so that these children can be free.
We've started to appreciate what they call the greatest generation as they dwindle in numbers, and we start to look at what they really did for this country, and in such a humble manner. And it is very important to give a part of yourself back.
There's so many people that are afraid to go ahead and say, I want to volunteer. You ask them, and they're the best volunteers in the world.
You know, volunteering doesn't have to be that huge, but it should continue to be part of our lives.
You need to be involved. You need to help your community, to help your region, to help your state, to help your nation.
Start when you're young.
It's a way you can say thank you.
People can make a difference if they go do something. The people at the canteen made a difference in a lot of lives.